Good day. Hey, thanks for tuning into this episode of Historic Milwaukee, where topics of the history of Milwaukee, Wisconsin are presented with visuals. Some are done with still photos and voiceover. Others are presented as recorded video walking tours. This presentation examines the history of the historic Third Ward. Today, this district is the hip and happening place to be. It's home to many galleries, restaurants, upscale shops, and creative class. It wasn't always such a trendy place, however. In this presentation, which is a three-part series, we look at three distinct eras of the district. This episode will cover the time prior to the fire of 1892. Let's take a look at it. I'm not sure of the exact timeline. Tens of thousands of years are challenging to comprehend. I was here when the glaciers first carved out and filled the large body of water that forms my eastern boundary. I was around when the stream that starts about 104 miles to the north, flowing through the glacial till and becomes a grand river on its way to the lake, forming my western and southern boundary. The river and lake action carved out the 100-foot tall bluffs that are my northern boundary. I am, in essence, part of the estuary where the river meets the lake. My base is comprised of alluvial sediments brought by water from areas north and west of here. Below that lies the dolomite bedrock that has once the base of an ancient sea, perhaps. My shallow, watery existence, varying with the lunar pull on the lake and the seasonal differences, would now be described as a marshland, with two small islands for some relief. I am home to all sorts of aquatic life, fish, amphibian creatures, and waterfowl from that form an ecosystem of which I am a part. My existence remains by and large unchanging for a millennia. Some 12,000 years ago, just after the retreat of the last glacier, a new life form first appeared in the area. Humans, by today's terminology. A variety of nomadic people came to call this area their home, if only temporarily. These gentle people lived harmoniously with the land they inhabit and shared with all creatures that roamed in the area. Unfortunately, however, they sometimes would quarrel with others of their species. Little did I realize then how I would come to know this quarrelsome trait as an inherent quality of the human species. Nevertheless, as a rule, they took only which they needed, and they left only their footprints. They fished in my water that was so clear you could see the river bottom at 18 feet below the surface. The waterfowl served as additional sources of food, and the wild rice that grew among the other aquatic flora provided them with other necessary nutrients. These people referred to the land around me as the good land. Indeed, it was, and I am proud to have been a part of it. For another several thousand years, peaceful coexistence prevailed. A significant change began around 400 years ago. At first, that change started slowly. Change began to accelerate at an ever increasing rate and continues to this day. Another form of human began to find their way to the river that flows along my southern extremes. Their skin was of a lighter pigment than the current inhabitants. Their manner of dress and language also differed significantly. They came seeking furs of the land animals that lived in the immediate area. Some came bringing a message of an alternate deity and diseases that came from faraway lands. The indigenous people traded pelts for varied vestiges of foreign civilization. Those vestiges included, unfortunately, alcohol and armed conflict with and among other various competing foreign newcomers. After a 200-year tumultuous transition since the Europeans first visited this good land, settlements began and increasingly established on the lands at the top of the bluffs to my north. Times were rapidly changing for the indigenous people who were forced out to make way for the influx of white settlers. A never ending stream of newcomers with dreams and aspirations of wealth and prosperity were about to change not only the people, but the land itself. Arriving sometime prior to the indigenous peoples being pushed off and away was a fur trader by the name of Solomon Juno. He was among the first to see the area as more than just a trading post and began to establish a city. The western expansion of the new country was inevitable, and this location was right in the path. Juno saw the potential of the deepest river and the longest bay on the west of the Lake Michigan at that time. Starting from the trading post cabin located at what now the intersection of Water Street and Wisconsin Avenue, Solomon Juno and his partner Morgan Martin laid claim to the lands east of the river. Solomon's brother Pierre acquired the area that is my marshland. This new burgeoning metropolis needed new roads and developable land. The bluffs along my northern boundary were an excellent vantage point from which to view the river and lake, but not conducive to the development, and the marshlands that I was comprised of was an impediment to establishing a port. It was perhaps serendipity that brought the influx of Irish immigrants to the new city. Having left their homeland escaping overpopulation, persecution, and poverty, beginning in the early 1800s, they came to the east coast of the United States to start a new life. Many of the men worked as laborers constructing the roads and canals that would facilitate the western expansion. Many came west with that expansion and arrived here just in time to provide the labor to level the bluff and change my topography forever. The spoils from the bluff reduction were used to fill the marshland and create additional dry land for development. I transformed from a marshland to dry land and became part of the Third Ward. Those English immigrants wasted no time making me their own, constructing modest dwellings on the eastern half of my newly formed lands as soon as the fill was firm enough to support the foundations. The westerly portion of the river edge were devoted to a variety of commercial endeavors where ships would dock and unload products brought from the east and load up with raw materials of every description. In later years, the easternmost portion became freight sheds and yards of the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad. The neighborhood, created and occupied by the Irish, numbering over 4,000 inhabitants in 1850, was hardly sumptuous. The houses were small and tightly packed on narrow streets. The gas plant located at the southern end of the neighborhood burned a significant amount of fossil fuel to produce gas for lighting purposes. The air in the vicinity, therefore, remained constantly acrid and noxious. The Irish who settled here came in poverty and remained in that condition for quite some time. The men worked entry-level positions in the nearby warehouses and manufacturing facilities and later in the railroad industry. The women typically worked as domestic servants for the wealthy of Yankee Hill or in the service industry and hotels. The population of Irish in Milwaukee continued to grow, not only in the Third Ward, but also in Torrey Hill to the west and in Walker's Point to the south. But the Third Ward, however, was by far the epicenter of the Irish community of Milwaukee during the mid to late 19th century. The number of people living in this place and their level of poverty was a formula for failure. The Third Ward held many of the earlier Milwaukee's more dubious records and was looked down upon by the society elite. The Third Ward boasted of having the highest concentration of saloons in the city. The area was also known to have the highest arrest record of anywhere in Milwaukee due to the large number of fights that took place there. The local newspapers repeatedly ran stories of drunken brawls that occurred on my soil, and these undesirable statistics and stories resulted in the area receiving the moniker the Bloody Third. While lawlessness and poverty appeared to be a regular feature on my turf, there were a few other tragic events that further taint the Third War legacy. In 1860, an excursion boat, the Lady Elgin, sank off the shores of Illinois, where almost 300 persons perished on a return trip from Chicago, a majority of whom were Irish Third Ward residents. Another tragedy that claimed many lives of the Third Ward residents who worked as maids and kitchen staff at the Newhall House, once one of the most elegant hotels in the country. The fire, which occurred on here and on 10 January of 1883, that leveled the six-story wood structure, killing 70 people. But really, the most tragic and deplorable event in my early days as a Third Ward involved only one death, and not of a Third Ward resident, but at the hand of several of them. George Marshall Clark, an innocent black man, was murdered, lynched at the corner of Buffalo and Water Street by an angry mob who had erroneously blamed him for the death of an Irish Third Ward bar owner. As familiar to tragedy that I am, based on the aforementioned events, nothing could have prepared me for the next major disaster. Around 5:30 in the evening of 28 October 1892, an explosion of an oil drum in the Union Oil Company, located on Water Street just south of Detroit Street, now known as St. Paul Avenue. The fierce 50-mile-an-hour wind from the northwest fanned the flames. Heat, smoke, and hot embers spread eastward and lit the buildings across the street. At the corner of Broadway and Buffalo, the Bulb and Kip furniture and upholstery factory began to burn, adding to the conflagration that continued to move eastward at an alarming pace. And it brought destruction as it proceeded toward the lake. Even the assistants from Chicago, Kenosha, Racine, Oshkosh, and Manitowoc fire departments brought in by rail was of little benefit. The flames remained relentless as they engulfed the modest frame buildings that quickly disappeared as if they were made of paper. Shifts in wind direction expanded the path of destruction to the south as well. The firehouse on Broadway fell victim to the flames. Further east, the rail yards were soon ablaze, along with all of the buildings along Erie Street, adjacent to the river. By the time the conflagration was arrested, 4 people lost their lives, 2 of which were firemen. Over 440 buildings and 200 rail cars in a 20-block area were consumed. 2,500 people were homeless and lost a good deal of their earthly possessions. Damages are estimated at $4 to $6 million. That's $120 to $180 million in today's money. The Irish, who made the Third Ward their home, had already begun to move west to Merrill Park. The fire hastened that exodus, leaving only the smoldering ashes of the center of commerce and the challenged living condition that I once was. For a millennia, I have existed in a relatively unchanging state. In a matter of 5 decades, I have been transformed from a marshland teeming with life to a hard and challenged urban center and to a bed of ash and destruction. What could the future possibly bring? So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this first episode of Historic Third Ward from Marsh to Marvelous here on Historic Milwaukee. Watch for the next episode in the not too distant future.